So, why use films to make these points? Why not just explain it in a theoretical book? I mean, I think the theoretical books are valuable and necessary, but I found, in my own case at least, that when I was going through these changes, my mind, my intellect was compromised. I couldn't think clearly. If you're experiencing a death of sorts, if you're being overrun by an instinct or a drive or passion or something like that, then it's quite hard to retain one's balance and think clearly. But I found that what I could do, even if my rational mind wasn't working very well, I could call to mind particular images and films, and they seemed somehow to speak to what I was actually going through. And similarly, when I was going through my own transformation, I discovered the Gospel of Thomas, which is, again, a book that Campbell has quoted from. Discovered, I think, in about the 4th century after Christ. They dug it up in the Middle East, the Nag Hammadi library. It's like a Gnostic version of the Gospel text. It's different from the other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, and it's just the teachings of Jesus. So there's no narrative. There's no a virgin birth or anything like that. It's just the teachings of Jesus, supposedly. And it's deeply symbolic. So there's one Logian, one parable about to do with a lion, and I think it goes, happy is the lion, happy is the man who the lion shall eat, and the lion shall become man. No, I've got that wrong. Happy is the man who shall eat the lion, and the lion shall become man. Abominated is the man who the lion shall eat, and the lion shall become man. The lion is this instinctual power that's been repressed during the emergence of ego consciousness. And one way or another, that power within us, which is both spiritual and instinctual, is going to come to the surface, is going to be expressed. But if the lion eats the man, then that can be like an instinctual possession. We can be devoured by whatever it is in us that we're not expressing. But if the man, the person, can come to terms with this power symbolized by the lion and eat the lion, then that's, that power can be assimilated, and with the preservation of a fully human life, we can keep our integrity and yet still deal with the unconscious. So both those things, the Gospel of Thomas and mythic images, really for me were very accessible and helped give me orientation in a way that I just couldn't get from books. I couldn't read, I couldn't think. So that was one of my motivations in writing this book. That people would, everyone knows these scenes from Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or The Matrix or whatever it might be. So that they're easy to call to mind. They're like a set of cultural reference points that we can draw on if we know how to see them in terms of this psychological crisis rather than a literal hero's journey battling external forces. I don't think the deeper message of those films is to do with that. I think, like Campbell said, that these things point to psychological realities. So, I was going to give more examples, but I need to move on to the other book. But basically, I use examples from film, and I use not just popular film, but Federico Fellini. I think he's really good, the Italian director in the 60s, like 8½, La Dolce Vita. There's some great symbolic material in there. And I weave in some classical myth and also Christian teaching as well. So that's the book on the hero's journey. This book, this came out this year, 2013, and this book, The Archetypal Cosmos, I wrote over about 10, 11 years, but it came out in 2010 or 2011. And this book is on archetypal astrology, which is my other main focus alongside individuation and the hero's journey. What I intended to do when I wrote this book, and I started in the late 90s, I'd actually been traveling in the US, and I was reading Campbell's book, The Mythic Dimension, which some of you might have seen, and in there he's got an essay, I think it's called the mystery number of the goddess. It's either that or the occult in myth, art, and literature. They're both similar essays, and they both are to do with mythic numerical patterns that are kind of woven through myths and seem to be, in some sense, inherent to the deep psyche. And I had all these ideas of a pattern pervading everything, and pattern as this organizing force that was evident in astrology, in the arrangement between the planets, evident in the depths of the psyche, in the arrangement between the archetypes in the psyche. So I wanted to write a book that applied astrology to the hero's journey. That was my my aim. I wanted to show how you could use astrology, like your own astrological birth chart, and an understanding of where the planets are now and how they relate to your birth chart. It's called transits. How you could use astrology to illuminate the hero's journey. Okay? It seemed to me that the hero's journey is a universal model. It's a universal schema for psycho-spiritual growth, or the mystical journey, spiritual journey. And I felt that if you could bring in astrology, that would bring in an individual element. You would individualize that universal schema of the hero's journey. Like, you could know, like, I've got these two planets are in alignment in my chart, or these other two planets are in alignment in the sky for the next 2 or 3 years, and they're really focused in on my chart. And if you knew that, you could use that as a kind of way to figure out what are the major themes that are constellated in your own individual experience at any particular time. So, I mean, it's going to be hard for me to explain this well, but I didn't write that book. I didn't write that book because as soon as I got into writing about astrology, I was like, wow, it's going to make no sense to anyone. How can it be that a planet, 2 planets in the solar system can have any relationship to what is happening in the depths of our own inner life? I mean, it just seemed crazy. I mean, I knew that I was convinced of the value of astrology because I've been doing it for years, but I knew that in terms of the culture's worldview, astrology is nonsense. And you can't explain it scientifically in terms of gravitational forces or electromagnetism or anything like that. There's just no valid explanation. I think it was Carl Sagan, the cosmologist, who said the gravitational force of the midwife is stronger than any force from any planet at the moment the child is born. Gravity is negligible. So what I had to do in this book really was to try to present a new worldview, or a paradigm within which astrology could make more sense to people. And I thought, well, I just tried a couple of chapters doing the philosophy of astrology, and then 2 chapters became 3, became 4, became 5, and then the whole book then is on an astrological worldview. And what I do in this book is I use the new paradigm sciences. So Fritjof Capra, I'm sure you've heard of him. He wrote the Tao of Physics in the early 70s, mid-70s. David Bohm was a contemporary of Einstein, worked with Einstein a little bit, a physicist. I use his ideas. Rupert Sheldrake is another well-known new paradigm thinker in biology. And Pierre Teilhard de Chardin wrote the famous book, The Phenomenon of Man, about the evolution of the cosmos. I was studying with Richard Tarnas, who is best known for archetypal astrology. His book, Cosmos and Psyche, came out in 2006. So I was studying with him, and I was studying with cosmologist Brian Swim. And so I had, on the one hand, these cosmology, and I exposed myself to the new sciences, and on the other hand, I was getting young myth, archetypal astrology. And so what I tried to do is to bring Jungian ideas together with the new sciences to show how it could be that the same kind of self-organizing dynamic was at work in the arrangement between the planets in space and in the arrangement of the archetypes in the depths of the psyche. So that's what I try to argue for in this book. So I'm yet to write the book on archetypal astrology and the hero's journey. That's a future project. But So what I mean, I can give a couple of examples that might help you understand this. So in astrology, each of there are eight planets and the sun and the moon, and they're all called planets in astrology. So there are 10 planets, and each planet is associated with a specific archetypal principle. So like the sun, as I said earlier, is to do with the light of consciousness, the ego, the center of consciousness. The hero archetype, the sun descends below the horizon, the hero descends into the underworld, is reborn, the sun is reborn each day, each night. So that's the sun. It's the I principle, the intentional yang type energy of the personality, the assertive, self-expressive aspect of the self. And then the moon is more like the yin, the feminine, the yielding, the receptive, the containing matrix of existence, the mother, to do with the mother and the child archetypes. So then Mercury is to do with the mind, the rational mind, and each of the planets have their own particular archetypal meaning. Venus, Aphrodite, love, beauty, romance. And then the slower moving planets, particularly Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they seem to be really to do with like profound psychological and cultural transformation. So Pluto is connected to the archetype of rebirth. It's to do with instinct, empowerment, power drives, elemental power of nature, like Shiva-like creative, destructive power, the underworld, the mythic underworld, the whole death rebirth process that I've just been talking about. And Neptune is to do with the divine, spirit, enchantment, magic, mystery, image, myth, dream, the whole collective unconscious in Jungian terms. So that's, like the kind of a spiritual planet, and Pluto is this dark underworld, transformative, kind of the force of nature, to do with the force of nature, the power of nature. And then Uranus is to do with like awakening and freedom and liberation and revolution and rebellion. And in our own time, since 2007, the whole world has been living under an alignment, a major alignment between Uranus and Pluto. They're 90 degrees apart in the sky. Okay, so what you get is Uranus to do with rebellion, revolution, the new, creative change, disruption, trickster, is empowered by Pluto. I said Pluto is to do with power, elemental force. And so you get, when you see Uranus and Pluto together in the sky, you get periods of revolutionary tumult and turbulence, like the 1960s. Uranus and Pluto were together in the same position in the sky. French Revolution, Uranus and Pluto were exactly opposite in the sky, 1789. They were in major alignment again in 1848, and a wave of revolutions across Europe. And then, lo and behold, in our own time, Uranus and Pluto are 90 degrees apart, and we get the Arab Spring and the whole revolutions in the Middle East, and the protests against the financial crisis in Greece. And just today, you probably saw the Ukraine protests, massive protests in Ukraine. They pulled down a statue of Stalin. It's just like this revolutionary fervor is just engulfing the world, and that reflects, from an astrological view, Pluto and Uranus coming together, the archetypes with those two planets coming together, and it's often a time of like technological empowerment, the space age in the 60s, and again we see in our own time suddenly China and India launch space missions. They want to get to Mars now, and it's like, whenever you get Uranus and Pluto together, there's a technological empowerment. Uranus is the new, the technological, the breakthrough, and Pluto's the power, the power of the atomic explosion. Pluto was discovered 1931, and I think the nucleus of the atom was split in 1930, or might be the other way around. Pluto is that kind of nuclear, titanic energy. That is how Pluto manifests. So what you can do, if you know a little bit of astrology, is to look at your chart, see what's happening at any time, and say, oh, wait a minute, I've got Pluto is aligned with Saturn in my chart for 3 years, 4 years, and those two principles together, they often correlate with death rebirth processes or intense crises. Saturn is the archetype of the old, like death, crystallization, the problematic side of life, suffering, mortality, constriction, blocks, the no response, negation. It has a bad press in astrology, and you can see why. It's Saturn. People generally don't experience Saturn very favourably, but it's also to do with qualities like maturation, gravitas, and structure, and containment, positive qualities as well as these negative ones. So if you know that you've got Pluto aligned with Saturn in your chart for 3 or 4 years, you can expect experiences like extreme, feeling very constricted, or feeling like your old self is dying, or feeling like everything secure in your life is being somehow destroyed and things are being rebuilt and reforged on a deep level. And if you know that, that's valuable information to think, because what might seem to be a traumatic and an extremely confusing, troubling experience, if you can look and see, what you actually Pluto Saturn in my chart, and know what that means, it gives like a cosmological context, a framework that can help you render what is happening more conscious. You can become more conscious of the transformative process that is taking place within you. And it just gives meaning, it gives deep life meaning. So that even though the suffering might not be diminished if you're going through a death rebirth process or an existential crisis, the suffering is going to be the same, but if you can bear the suffering meaningfully, then that can totally transform you. Was it Jung said that meaning makes a great many things bearable, perhaps everything. I think that's true. And someone like Viktor Frankl, logotherapy, he had a similar emphasis on meaning. He survived concentration camp, and it was just came out convinced of that if you could find meaning in your existence, you can survive anything. And I think that is what both the hero's journey model and archetypal astrology can give you. So you can use astrology to illuminate different periods of your life, and you can go back through your life and you can say, what was happening when I was 25? Why did I feel like that then? And it can be quite a revelation to study the astrology, what was happening then. I don't believe that astrology can be used for prediction. If you read the sun sign stuff, it's kind of superficial. And a lot of astrology is still like very literally predictive. This is going to happen to you in 2 years' time. This is going to happen in 3 years' time. Very precise. I don't use astrology that way. And archetypal astrology is to do with understanding these deep underlying themes that are constellated in life at any time, and how you experience Pluto Saturn might be very different from the next person. One person might be, I don't know, I've done readings with people, someone was carrying twins, was pregnant with twins, and the whole heavy burden of carrying that and then raising 2 children, that fits Pluto Saturn. Or someone like Al Gore, who confronts the environmental crisis and takes that on as a huge burden. He's got a Pluto Saturn in his chart. Jung has Pluto Saturn, the whole focus on Herculean strength, surviving the death rebirth process. Nietzsche, another Pluto Saturn person, or Aurobindo, the Hindu philosopher. People with Pluto Saturn in their chart generally are focused on intense struggle. There's a certain weightiness to their experience, and often a compression and a constriction. But it can come through in a wide variety of ways. I'm thinking like Nick Drake, the 60s musician, he had Pluto Saturn. And I think for someone like that, it was almost pulled him to suicide. It was a very dark, kind of overwhelming complex in his life. And it can come through that way. Pluto Saturn can be like tremendous reserves of energy and resilience to carry a world historic destiny, to carry this huge burden on one's shoulders. Pluto's the power, the titanic empowerment. Saturn is the weight, the burden. So The idea with astrology, and this is to quote Richard Tarnas, is that it's archetypally predictive. It's not concretely predictive. You can't know concretely by looking at a chart what you're like, what your life is like, what's going to happen. That's not the idea. Astrology illuminates the archetypes. You can map on the Jungian archetypes, or the gods and goddesses of myth, to the planets. So the shadow is connected to Saturn. Shadow is to do with one's inferior traits and things we find embarrassing or we feel guilty about. That is Saturn in astrology. Pluto is to do with the rebirth archetype. Jung discusses the rebirth archetype, and also Dionysian empowerment, empowerment by the instincts. That is Pluto. Or Neptune is to do with the archetype of the spirit in Jungian language. Or the moon is connected to the anima and the mother and the child. All three Jungian archetypes are to do with the moon. So the idea is that astrology can be used at this archetypal level, and what it can give you then is an archetypal map of your experience, your personality, and that, I argue in here, in this book, can be used to individualize the monomyth. So you can have the sense of like going through this process of awakening and crossing the threshold and the underworld descent and returning to the surface and going through the opposites, and that process going on and on. But then the astrology can give you the specifics. What is happening during these 2 or 3 years? What's happening then? And my idea is that, and this is going to be the topic of a future book, is that you can bring these two together in quite a creative way. So this book really then is the theory. I make that argument that I've just outlined to you now, but it's to do with the synthesis of Jung and the new sciences. And I argue that we think of myth, we think of archetypes as being to do with the inner world. Campbell said that myths are products of the psyche and they pertain to the psyche. And I agree with that, but it depends on what you understand by psyche. Is the psyche just inside us? Is it our inner world? Or is it the inside of everything? Is it the interiority of nature, the interiority of the universe? And that's what I argue here, that the psyche should not be understood as a wholly personal individual psyche, even if it's a collective unconscious, but that the collective unconscious, the deeper psyches, and somehow part of a single reality with the external universe, that it's all one world. It's the unus mundus, is the term that the Hermetic philosophers use, the unus mundus. It's a single undivided reality. And we tend to think that inner and outer are quite separate. This is a consequence of the Cartesian René Descartes split between mind and matter, subject and object. But I think at a deeper level, inner and outer are part of this single reality. And that is how astrology derives its validity, because the depths of the psyche and the depths of the order of the universe ultimately come out of the same ground, I think. They come out of the same dynamic ground, is the term I use in here, or the underlying dimension of reality. And archetypes in their deepest nature are rooted in this underlying dimension. It's a complicated argument, but that is the view that I try to present here. What this means for myth, I think, is that we shouldn't think of myth as being wholly to do just with psychology, because if you've got two planets in alignment at a certain period of time, that's to do with certain mythic archetypal themes, then it shows that myth is part and parcel of reality as a whole. That it's not just psychological, but at an archetypal level, myth is pervading everything, that it's structuring and shaping our experience of reality year by year. So that's the idea I present here. So I'm going to open it to you if you've got any questions. How are we doing for time?
Perfect. We got like
5-10 minutes.
Yeah.
I know it's a lot to take in.
So the other planets that have names of the gods, like Jupiter or Mars, do they happen to coincide with the qualities we think of as Jupiter and Mars? Or
But
is
what do you-
either different?
What do you think of the qualities of Jupiter? Like the bigness?
Well, no, Jupiter's like Zeus,
Oh,
the
the Zeus,
king,
yeah, well,
and Mars, because that sounded
yeah.
like Pluto, and Mars is more warrior. So.
Yeah. Well, Mars is to do with aggression, assertion, the warrior archetype, and Jupiter. It kind of is the big planet, and it amplifies, it exalts, it raises things up, it improves, and it's to do with success, granting success. It has a regal quality, so yeah, that's true. So yeah, it's not that you can reduce the, it's not that you can link back the planets in astrology just to the Greco-Roman gods, but the Greco-Roman gods personify certain aspects of the archetypes. So the archetypes in astrology are more general, like the moon is the anima, the child, and the mother. 3 archetypes mapped onto one. And with Zeus, there's the quality of Saturn too, because he's like a patriarchal ruler, like a Yahweh kind of. So that's more to do with Saturn. So it's not a direct one-to-one correspondence, but certainly there's some relationship to the Greco-Roman gods.
So did you have to kind of look at different cultures and their interpretation of astrology, because you have to be almost a collective. This culture says the moon is.
Yeah.
This culture says it's this.
Yeah.
And they're going to sometimes maybe disagree. Is my guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about the Vedic astrology, but I mean, what you can do is you could see how the Hindu pantheon of gods and goddesses, how they illuminate different aspects of the Western astrological system. Like the example of Shiva, Pluto is to do with Shiva Shakti, Kundalini power, or like something like a Kali type goddess would be like a moon Pluto, a creative, destructive, feminine female goddess. So I think, there are cultural differences in the way that astrology is interpreted, but I think, for me at least, ultimately there seems to be this like Platonic Pythagorean element to astrology whereby the archetypes are actually rooted in reality itself, a metaphysical framework. And this goes beyond what Jung would say, he was very much concerned with just what's happening in the psyche, not really doing metaphysics. But Richard Tarnas said that there are at least 3 dimensions to the archetypes in astrology, and they are the Platonic metaphysical dimension, the Homeric mythic dimension, and then the Jungian psychological instinctual dimension. And so you can approach an understanding of the archetypal principles in astrology through all those perspectives.
Would the metaphysical be more like deterministic, or?
Yeah, it's not. No, metaphysical. Astrology. It's not deterministic in that, like I said, it's not concretely predictive. You can't, and it's not causal in the sense of one billiard ball strikes another one, strikes another one. It doesn't work like that. It seems to be to do with the framework of meaning within which events unfold. So you can still, you could still understand what happens in your life today by looking back last week, last month, and you can see the chain that leads to where you are now. But if you look at astrology, that shows like a framework of meaning within which those day-to-day, moment-to-moment events take place. So, in Aristotle would call that a formal cause rather than an efficient cause, to give it the jargon. An efficient cause is the A, B, C, D, E chain, and a formal cause is the pattern in an acorn that makes it grow into an oak tree. That kind of deeper pattern. So the idea is that there's a formal cause in reality as a whole, or in the universe, and that is reflected in the archetype studied in astrology. And so that doesn't make invalid the A, B, C, D, E causes, but it just creates the meaning within which they take place. It's kind of difficult to understand.
Like a gestalt.
It's what, sorry?
It's like a gestalt.
Yeah, gestalt is a good word. It's complex holism is a term that's been used, where both there's an individual autonomy and concrete specificity, and also there's like a universal holistic perspective, and the two are kind of held in balance. microcosm, macrocosm is the old way that used to be described, as above, so below. But what I try to do here is, I think a lot of astrologers wheel out the microcosm, macrocosm idea, or the as above, so below. I try to give that a more contemporary perspective by explaining it in depth psychological and scientific terminology. I found for me personally that I was not satisfied with what seemed to me to be an ancient view of the universe, when the modern view, the modern scientific view, seems to discredit astrology. I wanted to show how, on the new paradigm sciences at least, or the developments in modern physics, could disclose a worldview in which astrology made more sense, that it didn't seem totally ridiculous. The idea that everything is interconnected, that modern physics has disclosed, or at the quantum level there seems to be something like an underlying ground, or things far apart in space can be entangled, quantum entanglement, and things that are, seem totally disparate have a connection at some deeper level. So there's a lot of things in the new sciences that are conducive and compatible with an astrological view of the world. But it's not deterministic in the sense of, like, you go to an astrologer and they tell you, this planet's moving into a certain position in your chart is going to cause this. That, it's not that. It's certainly not fatalistic. I do believe myself in fate, but I don't believe that astrology can show you that fate. It can help you understand the meaning, the themes, the patterns, but not the specific fate.
How do these planets develop these attributes that you're talking about? How does it get developed?
How do they work? Sorry.
You're saying planets have certain forces associated with them.
Oh, how do they
develop that?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process actually. It's something like Pluto was only discovered in 1930, and so I think a lot of it is astrologers working with charts, trying to figure out what planets mean. It goes back to astrology goes back to Mesopotamia, so this is like in 3,000, 4,000 years BCE. And if you look at Mesopotamian astrology, there's a semblance of a connection to modern astrology, but only just. It's like a thin thread, and then over the years, over the centuries, there's an ever greater refinement. Astrology flourished in Egypt and then in Greece, and there's a cross-fertilization of ideas, and then they obviously took on the names of the Roman names of the planets. But even if you go back to early 20th century, astrology is very, very literal, very predictive, and it's for a long time astrology was just to do with like kings and queens had astrologers, not and then it became more democratic. In the 20th century, it was rolled out to the masses, as it were, and I think that's really when psychological astrology was born. There was a guy called Dane Rudyard, who's a French guy, and he moved to the US, and he was very influential in launching psychological astrology. He was a theosophist, and also read Jung and Hindu philosophy, and he kind of brought it all together. So it's just an evolution. My other book, which I hadn't brought along, is on the new planet, or the planetoid dwarf planet Eris. They discovered Eris in 2005, and then Pluto was demoted. No longer a planet. So I wrote a book on what might Eris mean in astrology, and I identified these principles by which we might go about trying to figure that out. Like, you can look at synchronistically what's happening in a period of history when a planet was discovered. Well, Uranus is to do with revolution, and that was discovered between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, 1781. So there was a revolutionary flavour in the culture of that time, and it turns out, through the empirical study of Uranus in charts, that is what Uranus means. Or Pluto was discovered when nuclear power was discovered, or when in between the two world wars, when Freud's ideas were being disseminated to the wider culture about the depth, deep unconscious and instinct and the id, and when fascism was rising, Pluto to do with power drives and kind of fascist, zealous extremism. So there's a correlation between what a planet means and there seems to be a correlation between what a planet means and what was happening in history at that time.
Is that
And that's-
information readily accessible, or is it only in the book
What's
that
that,
you
sorry?
wrote? These associations between what was happening in history and the nature of the planet.
Yeah, I mean, I discussed them in my book on Eris. It's called Discovering Eris. This only applies, of course, to the modern planets because the planets such as Saturn have been known about since antiquity. So the meaning of those has kind of evolved, as I was just saying, over the centuries. But the modern planets, I had a friend who wrote a dissertation on at CIS in San Francisco on Neptune, the discovery of Neptune. Because the discovery of Neptune, there don't seem to be as many overt correlations to historical events as for Uranus and Pluto. But he wrote this huge dissertation basically looking at developments in the 19th century and how they mapped onto the meaning of Neptune, the romantic movement or the experimentation with drugs and the rise of kind of this universal compassion as a result of Dickens' novels on the suffering of children in Victorian England, and it's a really kind of nuanced study of 19th century. So I think there's something valid here, but part of his study was that he looked at how astrologers had initially worked with Neptune when it had been discovered. So the late 19th century, early 20th century, astrologers were attributing quite a wide range of qualities to Neptune, and it was like a progressive process of refinement through working with charts that a consensus was arrived at that Neptune means to do with dissolution and transcendence, spirituality and imagination and so on. And I think really it's only with Richard Tarnus's archetypal approach to astrology that we can really see the archetypes behind these planets. Tarnus makes explicit this correlation between planets and archetypes in a way that's not been done before, even though there are many Jungian-oriented astrologers. I recommend his book, Cosmos and Psyche. Really.
Astrology is built on the principle of synchronicity. And until...
but not calling those terms.
No, we understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, but until a person has experienced the synchronicity, it's just a word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Otherwise, we approach it from the point of view, okay, where's the evidence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I still think there can be a case for evidence. Perhaps not in a positivistic scientific sense, but like Cosmos and Psyche, where Tarnus points to historical correlations with specific planetary alignments. But it's true what you say about synchronicity. Until you've experienced synchronicity, or even when you do experience them, you can feel like you're going crazy, and these kind of things shouldn't be happening. And it's the same attitude that people bring to astrology. This is nonsense. How can planet relate to what I'm thinking? It just seems, in terms of what we learn about reality from our education, it just seems impossible. And so that's why I felt the need to write this book rather than just get into the stuff that I wanted to do. Because my excursion into science, it took me 11 years because I'm just far more at home in archetypal, mythic kind of stuff than the scientific world.
In your book, do you describe a new alignment that we have now? And
the one I just discussed, the Uranus-Pluto?
Yes. Do you describe
briefly
it in depth? Because you talked quite a bit about Mars and I don't know.
Yeah, in my book on Eris, I talk about contemporary events in terms of what that might mean, the possible meaning of Eris as the new planet. But I edit a journal called Archai, A-R-C-H-A-I, Archai Journal, and there you can download from the Archai Journal website. There are 2 quite long articles on current world events.
Okay.
Richard Tarnus wrote one, and then I co-authored the most recent one.
Oh, great.
So yeah,
Thank
that's where
you.
you.
Yeah.
That seems like a good note to end on. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great.